Well, now that we've violated every fire regulation in the county, we can begin. This is, of course, a very bittersweet moment. We've reached the end of our series on the forest, and are accordingly halfway through the Humanities Center's 3-year investigation into natural landscapes and human meaning. And our attention next semester will turn to the frozen realms, the realm of ice and glaciers and the poles. So please put all this on your calendars and come and see the exhibitions and the talks about that. But in this, the last session on the forest, the subject is, as you can see, the tree and its meaning. And to offer their thoughts and reflections on this theme, we have 3 fantastic members of USD's College of Arts and Sciences. Emily Bolender is one of the college's academic advisors, a role in which she provides academic support and counselling to undergraduate students. A USD alumna, she graduated with a BA in history before earning her MA at UCLA, where she researched medieval Italian law through an interdisciplinary lens. Now, Emily has a very profound connection to the Humanities Center, being one of our very first Keck undergraduate humanities research fellows, a fellowship in which she undertook sustained research into Norse law using primary references in Iceland. Stacie Vos is an adjunct assistant lecturer in the Department of English. She was educated at Yale Divinity School and at UCSD, where she received a PhD in medieval and Renaissance English literature. Dr. Vos has also worked as a curatorial assistant at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, where she held the H.P. Krauss Fellowship in Early Books and Manuscripts. She's also a writer of fiction, and her first chapbook, Long Story Short, was published in 2021. Dr. Vos is the founder of the Enclosure Group, a collective of scholars and artists exploring the history of female devotion. Our third panelist, John Yin, was educated at Peking University and subsequently at the University of Georgia, where he received his PhD. He joined the USD faculty in 2003, having spent 8 years teaching at Georgia State University in Atlanta. He's professor of environmental and ocean sciences. Dr. Yin's research is in the field of hydroclimatology, with special interest in the impact of recent and past climate variations on hydrological systems and water resources. He is currently involved in projects using tree rings to reconstruct past climates in various regions in China, and he has authored and co-authored more than 80 research articles. So for the last time in this forest series, please join me in welcoming to the Humanities Center Emily Bolender, Stacie Vos, John Yin. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that introduction. When Dr. Clack first emailed me about this series, I was a little overwhelmed. I could easily have spent 20 minutes alone just talking about sacred trees in Norse mythology and their relevance to any number of topics, from law and justice, my personal favorite, to death and rebirth. I could have pulled out all kinds of interesting, to me, archaeological evidence suggesting that the Norse used sacred trees as gathering spots for these great legal councils, and manuscript illuminations of funky little trees with giant squirrels on them, which you will see. I could tell you all about the literal translation of Yggdrasil as Odin's steed, and the particularly dark implication behind that meaning. And as a medievalist, that would have been all very well and good, and I could rest easy knowing that I had adequately prepared this audience to time travel back to Viking Age Scandinavia. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, we are bound in this time and place, and I think that our time tonight would be better served considering how the meanings of Yggdrasil have passed down to us from medieval to modern times. Sorry about that. In many ways, American culture has fallen back in love with the Norse and their culture. Recent hit video games like Skyrim, Assassin's Creed, God of War have all drawn on Norse aesthetics and cosmology to great acclaim. Neil Gaiman's retelling of Norse mythology that I'll be reading from was an immediate bestseller. TV shows like Vikings and The Last Kingdom remain popular on streaming services. We can even drive north about 30 minutes and attend the annual Vista Viking Festival here in San Diego. Yet, despite all this positive attention, certain groups have taken advantage of a mythologized, whitewashed understanding of Norse culture to nefarious ends. I'm sure I don't need to remind you all of who this gentleman is. I heard the chatter. Jacob Chansley, the so-called QAnon shaman, as we all know, entered the Senate floor during the January 6th insurrection where he thanked Christ and prayed for, quote, the United States to be reborn. You will note that his tattoos include Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, Yggdrasil itself, and a Valknut, or the knot of the slain. And it probably seems a little odd for an avowed Christian to be covered in these pagan symbols, but Chansley is far from the only violent right-wing extremist garbing himself in Norse myth. The Norwegian mass shooter who committed one of the deadliest attacks in Norway since World War II named his guns after weapons of the Norse gods. The Christchurch mass shooter alluded to Valhalla in his manifesto. Images from the deadly Charlottesville Unite the Right rally showed Nazi and Confederate flags next to depiction of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, and Odin's ravens. So how did we get here? Why are far-right terrorists so enamored with Norse mythology? What is the real meaning of the tree Yggdrasil, and who, if anyone, can claim to know that meaning? Is it even possible to reclaim a symbol once it has been so steeped in hate? So before we discuss Yggdrasil itself, I'd like to talk a little bit about the medieval Norse and their society, or as you may be more familiar with, Vikings. And because I love audience participation, I'm going to turn this question to you all. What do we know about the Vikings? Just shout it out.
They play in Minneapolis.
Thank you, Jim Bolender.
That's supposed to They incorrectly are shown with pointy helmets.
They are incorrectly shown with pointy helmets, and we'll get into that a little bit later. What else?
They used to comb the shores of Ireland and Scotland looking for cute young things.
This is actually true because a significant portion of Icelandic genealogy has, from Irish women from being taken as slaves, so that's not fun. Michelle?
Don't the women fight too?
The women could fight, yeah. What else? Yeah.
That Viking ghost on that show Ghosts, I learned more about Viking stuff from that than talking than anything else. If anybody hasn't seen it, it's hilarious. So.
I think I saw one more.
Great navigators and explorers.
So these are all great things, but how do we know these things? Movies and shows. Oh, yeah. How else do we know these things? Books. So maybe a better resource than movies and shows? Opera. Okay, deep cut, yeah. Very classy. Yeah, Wagner and a lot of other great operas for sure that we will also be talking about. Artifacts, yes. What kinds of artifacts? Preservation of their dead. Yeah, we've got longship burials. Shipwrecks. Ooh, that's a good one. Magnetic stones. Okay, cool. So we touched on a lot of things that I wanted to mention here. The huge spread of Vikings or Norse. We can see, as we mentioned, they were along the coast of England and Ireland, but they were also pretty much anywhere there was a significant river or waterway, through the Mediterranean, through the Black Sea. We have records suggesting that there were Vikings serving in Constantinople. We have actually artifacts that have been found in Sweden that have Arabic on them, so that we know that there was significant cultural contact between what we consider the Viking North and the rest of the world. So now that we've established what we do and maybe don't know about the Norse, let's turn to Yggdrasil itself. And I'm going to read a little bit from Neil Gaiman, who I mentioned earlier. The ash tree Yggdrasil is a mighty ash tree, the most perfect and beautiful of all trees, also the largest. It grows between the 9 worlds and joins them, each to each. It is the biggest of all the trees there are and the finest. The tops of its branches are above the sky. It is so large that the roots of the ash are in 3 worlds, and it is fed by 3 wells. The first root and the deepest goes into the underworld to Niflheim, the place that existed before other places. In the center of the dark world is the ever-churning spring, Hvelgrimir, so loud it sounds like a roaring kettle. The dragon Nidhogg lives in these waters and is always gnawing at the root from below. The second root goes to the realm of the frost giants, to the well that belongs to Mimir. There is an eagle who waits in the highest branches of the world tree and who knows many things, and a hawk who perches between the eagle's eyes. A squirrel, Retatosk, lives in the branches of the World Tree. It takes gossip and messages from Nidhogg, the dread corpse eater, to the eagle and back again. The squirrel tells lies to both of them and takes joy in provoking anger. There are 4 stags who graze on the huge branches of the World Tree, devouring the foliage and the bark. There are uncountable snakes at the base of the tree, biting at the roots. The World Tree can be climbed. It is from this tree that Odin hanged himself in sacrifice, making the World Tree a gallows and himself the gallows god. The gods do not climb the World Tree. They travel between the worlds using Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge. Only the gods can travel on the rainbow. It would burn the feet of any frost giants or trolls who attempted to clamber up it to reach Asgard. The last root of the World Tree goes to a spring in the home of the gods, to Asgard, where the Aesir make their home. Each day the gods hold their council here, and it is here that they will gather in the last days of the world before they set out for the final battle of Ragnarok. It is called the Well of Erd. So that's just a little bit detailing what our tree looks like. And I know here we have this lovely depiction that says, oh, this is how this is all organized. It's all made up. None of this is actually real. Nobody actually knows how this cosmology would have looked. So as we know from this excerpt, Yggdrasil is an enormous sacred ash tree, connecting these 9 worlds of the Norse cosmos, also commonly seen in other world cultures, known as like a pillar of the world or an axis mundi. The boughs of Yggdrasil stretch up into the heavens, the roots extend to the sacred wells that we mentioned. And scholars have spent decades debating how these 9 realms are organized and trying to translate these descriptions of the Norse cosmos into a sensible Cartesian map, but with no success. This stems largely from the fact that our sources on Norse mythology are incomplete, contradictory, heavily edited by actors ranging from nationalism to proselytism. Our written sources on Yggdrasil come predominantly from 13th century Iceland, almost 400 years after what we would consider to be the golden age of Vikings, or the Viking Age. You're probably familiar with that time period as the time when those terrifying bearded giants swooped down upon England and France, sacking monasteries, extorting kingdoms, sacrificing God-fearing folk, carrying off beautiful women, etc. But that's at least what the Christian chroniclers have told us. Much of what we know, or what we think we know, about Norse mythology comes from 2 books called the Prose and Poetic Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson around 1220 CE. And when I say written by Snorri Sturluson, what I actually mean is there's one oblique reference to Sturluson as the compiler of the Edda in one of the 7 surviving manuscripts. Regardless of Sturluson's authorship, we know that the Prose Edda was compiled in a Christianized Iceland at least 2 centuries removed from any kind of widespread pagan practice. Our stories from Sturluson on Yggdrasil are also often contradictory. There are many moments emphasizing the suffering and seemingly never-ending destruction of the tree. Our earlier excerpt told us about the malice striker Nidhogg constantly gnawing at the roots of the tree. Many scholars believe that Nidhogg plays a role as a herald of Ragnarok. At least 1, but possibly 4, stags tear at the leaves of Yggdrasil. But this destruction isn't all bad. As the stag, or stags, consume the tree, the morning dew gathers in their horns and trickles down to form the rivers of the world. Thus, this destruction of the tree is still linked with growth in another plane. Yggdrasil is not just a source of nourishment, though, but wisdom and law. I know, legal scholar, I had to come to it. Here's a slightly different retelling of the previous excerpt. An ash I know, Yggdrasil its name, with water white is the great tree wet. Thence come the dews that fall in the dales, green by earth's swell, does it ever grow. Thence come the maidens, mighty in wisdom, 3 from the dwelling down neath the tree. Earth is one named, Verthandi the next, on the wood they scored, and Skuld the 3rd. Laws they made there, and life allotted, to the sons of men, and set their fates. These maidens, the Nerns, are not the only beings giving laws beneath Yggdrasil either. The Aesir, who we mentioned earlier, are Odin's, Thor's, all those really big famous gods, meet every day beneath the tree to adjudicate disputes and dispense justice. However, the most famous instance that we have of Yggdrasil's wisdom-giving power is also one of the most gruesome. Meet Odin, the All-Father, the Flaming Eye, the Wanderer, King of the Aesir, the Andals, and the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the 7 Kingdoms, Protector of the Realm. I'm joking about those last few, but you get the point. Odin has many titles, many names. He also has something of a reputation for exchanging body parts for wisdom, such as the one time he plucked out his eye in exchange for a drink from Mimir's Well of Wisdom. In the poem Havamal, Odin recounts the time he sacrificed himself to himself. I ween that I hung on the windy tree, hung there for nights full 9. With the spear I was wounded, and offered I was, to Othin, myself to myself, on the tree that none may ever know what root beneath it runs. None made me happy with loaf or horn, and there below I looked. I took up the runes, shrieking I took them, and forthwith back I fell. 9 mighty songs I got from the son of Bolthon, Bestla's father, and a drink I got of the goodly mead poured out from Othorir. Then began I to thrive, and wisdom to get. I grew, and well I was. Each word led me on to another word, each deed to another deed. Runes shalt thou find, and fateful signs that the king of singers colored, and the mighty gods have made. Full strong the signs, full mighty the signs that the ruler of gods doth write. So, in case that was a little obscure, basically Odin puts himself up on a tree that we have agreed is Yggdrasil, and stabs himself, sacrificing himself to himself, and as the blood runs down his body, it makes the shape of runes on the ground beneath him. These runes that Odin receives are the root of magic and poetry. As I mentioned, scholars generally agree that the tree Odin hangs himself on was Yggdrasil, hence the meaning of Yggdrasil as Odin's steed. Thus, Yggdrasil is once more directly associated with this contradictory dyad of death and suffering, but also of rebirth and wisdom. This catastrophe continuity theme is best represented by Ragnarok, known as the Doom of the Gods. Almost all of the stories we learn in Norse myth are tied to Ragnarok in some way. For example, we can see Fenrir here biting the hand of the god Tyr as the Aesir attempt to restrain the wolf and hold back Ragnarok. The other illumination depicts the death of the god Balder, whose demise is often described as one of the last harbingers of Ragnarok. I'll read again from Gaiman to describe the events. If I can get to my bookmark. Heimdall will blow the Gjallarhorn, the horn that once was Mimir's, and he will blow it with all his strength. Asgard shakes with its noise, and it is then that the sleeping gods will wake, and they will reach for their weapons to assemble beneath Yggdrasil at Urd's well to receive the blessing and the counsel of the Nerns. Odin will ride the horse Sleipnir to Mimir's well to ask the head of Mimir for counsel, for himself and for the gods. Mimir's head will whisper its knowledge of the future to Odin, just as I am telling it to you now. What Mimir whispers to Odin will give the All-Father hope, even when all looks dark. The great ash tree Yggdrasil, the world tree, will shake like a leaf in the wind, and the Aesir and with them the Einherjar, all the warriors who died good deaths in battle, will dress for war, and together they will ride out to Vigrid, the final battlefield. And because there's a lot of battling and dying, spoiler alert, everyone dies. We're going to skip to the end. So Loki and Heimdall have been battling to the death. It is done, whispers Loki, dying on the battlefield. I have won. But Heimdall will grin then, in death, grin through golden teeth flecked with spittle and with blood. I can see further than you, Heimdall will tell Loki. Odin's son Vithar killed your Fenris wolf, and Vithar survives, and so does Odin's son Vali and his brother. Thor is dead, but his children Magni and Modi still live. They took Mjolnir from their father's cold hand. They are strong enough and noble enough to wield it. None of this matters. The world is burning, says Loki. The mortals are dead. Midgard is destroyed. I have won. I can see further than you, Loki. I can see all the way to the world tree, Heimdall will tell him with his last breath. Surtur's fire cannot touch the world tree, and 2 people have hidden themselves safely in the trunk of Yggdrasil. The woman is called Life. The man is called Life's Yearning. Their descendants will populate the earth. It is not the end. There is no end. It is simply the end of the old times, Loki, and the beginning of the new times. Rebirth always follows death. You have failed. Loki would say something cutting and clever and hurtful, but his life will have gone, and all his brilliance and all of his cruelty, and he will say nothing, not ever again. He will lie still and cold beside Heimdall on the frozen battlefield. Now Surtur, the burning giant who is there before the beginning of all things, looks out at the vast plain of death and raises his bright sword to the heavens. There will be a sound like 1,000 forests turning to flame, and the air itself will begin to burn. The world will be cremated in Surtur's flames. The flooding oceans steam. The last fires rage and flicker and then are extinguished. Black ash will fall from the sky like snow. That is how the worlds will end, in ash and flood and in darkness and in ice. That is the final destiny of the gods. That is the end, but there is also that will come after the end. There's a lot more. The sun will have been eaten, but the sun's daughter will shine in the place of her mother, and a new sun will shine even more brightly than the old, shine with the young light and new. The woman and the man, life and life's yearning, will come out from inside the ash tree that holds the world together. They will feed upon the green earth, and they will make love, and from their love will spring mankind. Asgard will be gone, but Idavall will stand where Asgard once stood, splendid and continual. So, as we heard, Yggdrasil is centered within many events of Ragnarok. The tree is damaged and trembling, yet serves as a refuge for the survivors. Even as the 9 worlds are consumed in fire, their ash forms the soil of these new realms. This is all just very deeply evocative of general Norse fatalistic attitudes and belief that the forces of creation and destruction are not only linked but interdependent. Just as a tree stretches its branches to the heavens, the downward thrust of its roots anchor it and provide life. So, how do we get from Yggdrasil, this wonderful center of the Norse universe, to Yggdrasil, possible hate symbol? Well, the long answer lies within a serpentine tangle of factors, including nationalism, romanticism, linguistics, and the mythopoetic men's movement of the 1970s. But since our time tonight is limited, we're just going to focus on the most direct link, the Nazis. Nazi ideology was not formed in a vacuum. We can certainly point to the destruction of World War I, the harshly punitive Treaty of Versailles, and popularity of texts such as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. But more insidious influences can be traced back through the 19th century. If communism was a specter hunting 19th century Europe, nationalism was busy recreating the movie Poltergeist. German nationalism in particular emphasized shared cultural identity and an ethno-linguistic unity. And what better way to culturally unify people than through art? German artists, composers, and authors drew deeply upon recent translations of Norse mythology to great acclaim. Consider Richard Wagner and his heroic depictions of the Valkyries. We all know it, the famous Ride of the Valkyries. It's hard not to feel heroic when listening to that music, or speed while listening to it on the freeway. And unfortunately, that feeling of greatness was not lost on the Nazis. That's right, we can blame Wagner for not only the whole horns on helmets Viking image, but also for inspiring Hitler. Hitler, as we know, was obsessed with legitimizing the Third Reich. After all, strengthening a national mythology is critical if you're an aspiring demagogue. A national mythology can argue for a nation's permanence and shared ancestry. The Nazi regime drew upon this popularity of Norse influences and cobbled them together to further their nationalistic agenda. Everything from the sagas to the runic symbols was pillaged in an attempt to glorify an idealized Aryan Norse heritage, which, by the way, never actually existed. The infamous logo of the SS itself is an example of Nazi runes used within propaganda and on military paraphernalia. On the usage of Norse runes in particular, the Anti-Defamation League states, in the 20th century, Nazis in Germany adopted the runic alphabet system, a system of writing used with many variations across pre-Roman Europe, among with many other similar symbols as a part of their attempt to reconstruct a mythic Aryan past. Nazi uses of the symbols like the Uthal or Life rune included the divisional insignia of 2 Waffen-SS divisions during World War II. Following World War II, white supremacists in Europe, North America, and elsewhere began using the Othala rune. Today it is commonly seen in tattoo form on flags or banners as part of group logos and elsewhere. But it is important to note that Yggdrasil is not among the many Norse symbols identified as hate symbols by the ADL. Which brings us back full circle to what we witnessed on January 6th. A self-professed Christian nationalist storming the Capitol in the performative trappings of a non-existent, racially homogenous Norse past. What does Yggdrasil mean to Jacob Chansley? Perhaps he genuinely believes the tree to be emblematic of his warped perspective on life. Perhaps for him, it is a symbol of hate. But thankfully, he does not speak for all medievalists, pagans, and tree enthusiasts of the world. Side note, as of, I think, yesterday, he filed paperwork to run for Congress, so he does wish to speak for people, so democracy. There are thousands worldwide who identify with the Norse religion, paganry, heathenism, and actually a 2017 study found that the vast majority of practicing heathens in the United States vehemently denounce white supremacy. Many who follow a form of Norse religion today emphasize the fact that ancient Northern Europeans were known to marry and have children with members of other ethnic groups, and that in Norse mythology, the Aesir did the exact same with the Vanir, Jotun, and humans, thus arguing that Norse belief and symbols, like Yggdrasil, are welcoming to all rather than being exclusive to one ethnicity. Medievalists, both contemporary and past, have brought attention to this association between Norse symbols and white supremacists. To quote Tolkien, that ruddy little ignoramus Adolf Hitler, ruining, perverting, misapplying, and making forever a curse to that noble northern spirit, a supreme contribution to Europe, which I have ever loved and tried to present in its true life. And of course, yours truly is here to bring attention to this issue. As I bring this talk to an end, I want to acknowledge that there's no easy or necessarily comfortable facts I can leave you with. You might even be a little more confused than before, because that's just kind of how Yggdrasil is. It's just confusing. We began by discussing the difficulties of understanding a symbolic tree with roots more than 1,000 years in the past, and have ended in a very uncertain future. Our sources to understand the Norse and their cosmology are sparse and require constant interpretation and evaluation. Maybe someone someday will find a Norse text hidden in an Icelandic attic, breaking down the exact gospel truth of Yggdrasil, but personally, I'm skeptical. The work of a historian is much like Yggdrasil itself, constantly in a state of decay and rebirth as sources disappear and reemerge, and a society in turn privileges and observes certain histories. Rather than cling to strict dichotomies, perhaps we can learn a lesson from Yggdrasil and willingly embrace the infuriating, illuminating tension crossing between the binaries we so often cleave to. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, for getting us started. Hi, everybody. I've asked for a slight dimming of the lights, if that's. I don't know if it's going to work. It's okay if it doesn't. Is that okay for everybody? Can see? Perfect. Okay, great. Okay, so thanks so much to Ryan and to everybody for being here. I've actually been teaching pastoral literature, so I'm grateful to my students for being here. We've been participating in this series and as an extension of our class. So, and I've kept my title very open because I think that trees are helpful for lots of digressions. So, on some trees in English literature. I'm not sure how to, okay. Dorothy Wordsworth writes in her journal entry of January 30th, 1802, "He asked me to set down the story of Barbara Wilkinson's turtle dove. Barbara is an old maid. She had 2 turtle doves. One of them died the first year, I think. The other bird continued to live alone in its cage for 9 years, but for 1 whole year it had a companion and daily visitor, a little mouse that used to come and feed with it, and the dove would caress it and cower over it with its wings and make a loving noise to it. The mouse, though it did not testify equal delight in the dove's company, yet it was at perfect ease. The poor mouse disappeared, and the dove was left solitary till its death. It died of a short sickness and was buried under a tree with funeral ceremony by Barbara and her maiden and 1 or 2 others." The he who has commissioned this brief modern fable is William Wordsworth, Dorothy's brother and co-author with Samuel Coleridge of the Lyrical Ballads. A tale in miniature about animals as couples and about the relationship between humans and animals and nature more generally, Dorothy's fable ends with an image upon which so many before and after her, not least her brother William, have relied, the image of a mourning mother under a tree. This is a traditionally feminine trope most commonly linked to the sorrow of the Virgin Mary at the death of her son. Trees are used to mark time and place, to remember the dead, and in particular to remember those who, like Jesus, suffered painful deaths. My contribution to this series on the forest will take us to the spiritual and literary significance of trees. In the simplest terms possible, my take on the tree is that it can make us sad, and it can give us something to write about. To borrow from a tree-ridden play, Shakespeare's As You Like It, this plant in the forest makes us, as Duke Sr. says of the melancholy Jackass who has sat down on a tree to mourn an injured deer in the forest, full of matter. Although a tree is fixed in the ground, it can be moved, cut up, and made into moving parts that we encounter anywhere. In some cases, the tree can become a resting place for an object we did not expect to encounter. And here I'm thinking back to the opening reception to this series, where Dr. Clack recalled having stumbled upon an abandoned copy of Anna Karenina on a tree stump in Idlewild. A tree can even grow into places we have attempted to build apart and away from nature. This past weekend, I visited a cafe in Pasadena where I noticed that there were 2 rugs in the bathroom oddly placed on the floor. And then I saw a sign on the door explaining that the rugs were a feeble attempt to cover up something very powerful coming up through the floor, a tree. The owner of the cafe, Julie, writes, "Dear guests, my apologies for this unsightly wood plank. Underneath lies a rather large tree root coming for the ficus tree on the sidewalk. We await the city's next step, as it is a city-owned tree. In the meantime, I have yet to find a suitable rug to cover the plank, but continue to look. If you have any ideas on where to find one, please let me know." I had to add this to the talk. It was irresistible. Whether it's a root coming up through the floor or a cross hanging on the wall, trees represent the persistence of the past and perhaps the future as well upon us. In the Middle Ages, children were taught to write just as they learned of the crucifixion or passion of Christ. This may seem to us cruel, but at the time, children were encouraged to think of their own complicity in the death of Jesus as they learned their ABCs. One lyric describes this educational process as follows, and I'll only read part of this. "When a child to school shall set be, a book for him is brought, nailed on a board of tree." This lyric describes the tablet brought to a child learning the alphabet. It is decorated with red ink that is meant to teach the child, some sources say, of Christ's death. A sermon from the time by Odo of Cheriton states that just as the sheet on which the ABC is taught to children is fixed with 4 nails to a board, so the flesh or skin of Christ was stretched on the cross. One of the stories that William Caxton, England's first printer, included in his Golden Legend of 1483 tells the story of the finding of the true cross, which Caxton translates as the invention of the new cross. In the translation of this narrative, Caxton emphasizes the paradoxical nature of the cross, which saved humankind, but which also came of the tree by which we were damned. "The cross was made out of 4 manner of trees," he writes, "the palm, the cypress, the cedar, and the olive." Caxton's translation continues from here by describing the miracle of the cross as seen by Constantine, who has a vision one night during the siege of the barbarians. The vision is of a text that is written in gold upon the cross, stating, "Then saw he the cross made of right clear light, and it was written thereupon with letters of gold, In this sign thou shalt overcome the battle." Then was he all comforted of this vision, and in the morning he put his banner on the cross and made it to be borne for him and his host. This legend, as produced through Caxton and his press, emphasizes the material production of the text, from the wood that makes the cross to the miraculous message it will carry. Constantine does not stop at just having the vision, but actually reproduces the words he sees and carries them as a banner into battle. It's Constantine, too, to whom Thomas Brown turns when he describes the difference between the meaning of the tree in ancient Rome compared to early Christian culture. In his work, Garden of Cyrus, he introduces Cyrus as a person of high spirit and honor. Good book design, isn't it? A person of high spirit and honor, naturally a king, though fatally prevented by the harmless chance of postgeniture. Not only a lord of gardens, but a manual planter thereof, disposing his trees like his armies in regular ordination, so that while old Laertes hath found a name in Homer for pruning hedges and clearing away thorns and briars, while King Attalus lives for his poisonous plantations of aconites, henbane, hellebore, and plants hardly admitted within the walls of paradise, while many of the ancients do poorly live in the single names of vegetables. All stories do look upon Cyrus as the splendid and regular planter. Brown goes on to praise Cyrus for his ability to plant rows and orders so handsomely disposed, or 5 trees so set together that a regular angularity and through prospect was left on every side. These lines, writes Brown, are accommodable unto plantations of large growing trees, and we must not deny ourselves the advantage of this order. While we could dwell on the impressive order of Brown's sentences, I would like to turn to the other order to which he refers here, which is that of the plantation. One of the most fascinating catalogs of trees I've ever read is in Richard Ligon's A True and Exact History of the Island of Barbados. I don't know if anybody here has read this text. This text was written as a manual for those establishing plantations in late 17th century England, and it's a wonderful example of early English prose writing, nature writing, and the ways in which these modes of composition intersect with the promotion of the transatlantic slave trade. Toward the end of the text, Ligon describes the banana tree as a religious object. I'm not going to read all of these quotations because some of them are rather long. Ligon presents plantation slavery as ordained by God, evidenced by the shape of the banana tree, which is planted in order to introduce Christianity in Barbados. We can see in both Brown and in Ligon attention to the tree as a physical and natural marker of hierarchies grounded in sex and race-based domination. These texts both use Christianity as a justification for these systems of order and oppression. A very different example can be found in the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, who describes a magical root given to him by a friend called Sandy Jenkins. Sandy tells Douglass that he has a root he carries with him which prevents violence from white men. He told me I must go with him. I'm sorry, these are images from Ligon. I got a little bit. I was trying to show that the Ligon book actually has a lot of really beautiful illustrations and really beautiful writing, but also it's a manual for how to start a plantation and enslave people. So it's, So this is now on to Frederick Douglass. He told me I must go with him into another part of the woods where there was a certain root which, if I would take some of it with me, carrying it always on my right side, would render it impossible for Mr. Covey or any other white man to whip me. Despite his reluctance to take Sandy's root or to show how it could be effective against physical threats, Douglass nonetheless is able to defend himself against Covey once he is carrying the root. Douglass helps us to see that the tree, as interpreted by those who are oppressed, is quite different from the other examples I gave above. Rather than seeing the tree as a sign of order or even as a site for Christian worship, the root shared between Sandy Jenkins and Frederick Douglass takes on the meaning that they developed together in language. And this meaning is set down by Douglass within his narrative of former captivity that leads to transformative education and literacy until he establishes himself as a writer within the English canon. With this in mind, I'd like to conclude with a few similar treatments of trees in semi-canonical works by women writers. In each case, we could see the vision of the tree as a means by which the writer establishes authority, despite the fact that her literacy and authorship are held in doubt. Like the fable of Dorothy Wordsworth with which I open, each of these have the qualities of the fable and the anecdote. These are dream visions in miniature, representing a form of knowledge that cannot be verified or contained. The first of these comes from the book of Marjorie Kemp. Called by scholars the parable of the pear tree and the defecating bear, this is a narrative that Marjorie shares while being questioned for heresy by the archbishop at the turn of the 15th century. She says, "Sir, by your reverence, I spoke but of one priest by way of example, who, as I have learned, went wayward in a wood through the sufferance of God for the profit of his soul, until the night came upon him. He, destitute of his lodging, found a fair garden in which he rested that night, having a fair pear tree in the midst, all flourished with flowers and embellished, and blooms full delectable to his sight, where came a bear, great and violent, ugly to behold, shaking the pear tree and knocking down the flowers. Greedily this grievous beast ate and devoured those fair flowers, and when he had eaten them, turning his tail end in the priest's presence, voided them out again at the shameful part. Very strange story, right? The archbishop, the book tells us, likes his tale. And following the core parable, Marjorie describes the palmer to whom the priest speaks about this sight or vision he has in the garden. Providing no interpretation herself, Marjorie envelops a critique of church authorities in a story she has learned in her private communication with God. In a later work of spiritual autobiography, Agnes Beaumont, who is famous for the scandal of riding on the back of John Bunyan's horse one day when she had no way to get to church, tells of the apple tree in her father's yard. And here are some images of her manuscript. Actually, this is not in her hand. This is a later copy that I just found when I used to have Stax access. Brian mentioned that I used to work at the Beinecke Library, and I just opened this book one day, and I really liked the handwriting. And I was also, I thought this was kind of funny that there's a character called Mr. Halfhead who was supposed to be helping her with something. But she kind of, whoever this scribe is, made all of the names really prominent in the manuscript. So it's originally from 1674, but it gets copied later and printed later, and it seems to have been somewhat popular. You can also read it now in the back of Grace Abounding by John Bunyan. So it's kind of become part of a spiritual autobiography mini canon, although not many people have heard of her. So she tells this story. She says, one dream I told Sister Pruden, which she had told me of after my father was dead. Methoughts in my father's yard grew an old apple tree, and it was full of fruit. And one night, about the middle of the night, there came a very sudden storm of wind and blew this tree up by the roots. And I was sorely troubled to see this tree so suddenly blew down. I run to it as it lay upon the ground to lift it up, to have it grow in its place again. I thought I see it turned up by the roots, and my thoughts I stood lifting it as long as I had my strength, as it lay upon the ground, first at one arm, then at another, but could not stir it out of its place to have it grow in its place again. At last left it and run to my brothers to call for help to set this tree in its place again. And I thought when my brother and his men did come, they could not make this tree grow in its place again. And oh, how troubled was I for this tree, and so grieved that the wind should blow that tree down and let others stand. And many such things that I see afterwards did signify something. Beaumont's final line here, and many such things that I see afterwards did signify something. Sorry, that's my next slide. Suggests that for her, this dream of the tree represents symbolism itself. Later, when telling of the moment when her father dies, she writes, as some afterwards said, my dreaming of the apple tree did signify something of this. In other words, she was able to foretell her father's death. One final tree vision takes us beyond the religious context to the post-Enlightenment romantic writing of Mary Shelley, who in Frankenstein writes of a tree that is struck by lightning. This is a fairly famous passage, so I'm confident many of you have read it before. This is when Victor Frankenstein tells Walton of the catastrophe of a tree which he witnessed at age 15. When I was about 15 years old, we had retired to our house near Bellerive when we witnessed a most violent and terrible thunderstorm. As I stood at the door, on a sudden I beheld a stream of fire issued from an old and beautiful oak, which stood about 20 yards from our house. And soon as the dazzling light vanished, the oak had disappeared and nothing remained but a blasted stump. When we visited it the next morning, we found that the tree shattered in a singular manner. It was not splintered by the shock, but entirely reduced to thin ribbons of wood. I never beheld anything so utterly destroyed. Amazingly, this motivates Victor and sets him upon his quest to learn about lightning and electricity and ultimately making life in a lab. Shelley's critique of this masculine pursuit is present in her description of the blasted stump. She gives us a character who sees utter destruction and becomes intent on producing it himself. And he succeeds at that. These three examples, along with Douglas's root, all represent responses to overwhelming expressions of patriarchal power. The vision of the tree becomes one way to produce unorthodox opinions, at once a symbol of Christ's death and a fantasy of natural order. It is also a representation for the unknowable and the uncontrollable, like the ficus root growing through the cafe floor. And I thought, since I had such negative examples at the end here, I would just close by bringing up a poet who Brian mentioned in the opening lecture, John Clare. He's called the peasant poet often. But he has a really nice, he has so many poems about trees and sees trees as a resting place or a place that something you can climb so that you have a good view of what's going on, especially in the countryside. So I just thought we could look at these last two lines of him humming of future things that burns the mind to leave some fragment of itself behind. Thank you so much.
So today I learned a lot about the meaning of the trees from the perspective of history or religion or literature. But I remember that when I was little, I've heard this many, many times from my teachers who were saying, when you grow up, you want to be like a tree because you'll be tall. All the Chinese parents are just obsessed for their kids to be tall, for one. And also you'll be straight, to be a righteous person when you go up, right? That's what we're being taught. And of course, up to the middle school years, they don't say that anymore. But even today, the elementary school teachers, middle school teachers, they're known, in China at least, they're known as the gardeners of mind, or gardeners for the society. So they're supposed to have very high social status, okay, but only in names, probably. They also say that if you truly grow up as a tree, you have a long longevity. And that's what I'm looking for, okay? So here you can see the tree rings, and for those of you who, took a look at the tree ring sample just to pass along, you'll see that the center portion of the piece of the wood, you have the tree ring, and you have these rings, and each one of these will represent one annual growth. And then it's made of, essentially this much. That's one annual growth of a given tree. And then, obviously, especially when we're talking about climate change, you'll be able to use to convert the annual growth of the trees, right? You have these narrow rings, wide rings, and then converting that to some sort of a weather patterns that's related to the growth of the trees. So it all comes actually from this guy. For all of these sort of hypotheses or principles, for all the biologists here, okay, that's like given, okay. Basically says that the growth of the trees, right, the width of these tree rings should reflect the growth condition. And that growth condition is being controlled essentially by the supply of nutrients from the roots and to the leaves, and from the leaves to different parts of the trees and so forth. And all that movement will be controlled by how much water that you have. Whether you have enough fluid to carry all these things throughout the tree, right? So that's all like a common knowledge of this. But this guy was an astronomer. So for an astronomer, for a physicist to propose this around the early 1900s. That's kind of a special, okay? And especially, he said that for the trees growing in the same area, they're going to be controlled by the same set of factors that will control the growth of these trees. And therefore, by looking at the patterns of the growth, the narrower years, the wider years, you will be able to connect these tree ring samples together. Okay, so that's what I do. I hike up the Tibetan Plateau, northeastern corner of the Tibetan Plateau, and use this very simple tool to drill a hole into the tree and then take out the tree ring core. And then the tree ring core is mounted on this piece of wood, like the one that I passed along. That's the very center of the tree, and every single ring has to be counted and measured to get to the ring width. And this number, 1045, that was the year when the tree was alive. So that's how old those tree ring samples that you have actually in your hand. Each one of those will be anywhere from 800 to 1,000 years old. And then, of course, when we find a large tree, we're all very excited, so we can get a long record. So this is the deal, right? You have the patterns of wider rings and narrow rings, and then you will be able to match these patterns from the living trees to the dead trees, and from the dead trees to archaeological wood. And that's also how A.E. Douglas studied the Native American ruins in southwestern United States. And actually, that's one of his major accomplishments. And I think, right, from my perspective, I think he probably did that. He made more contribution by doing that as compared to his astronomical work. No, but that's just my perspective. All right. So this is my study site. You can see we took samples from all of these green squares and the circles, and it's at the northeastern corner of the Tibetan Plateau, but that's essentially northwestern part of China. Okay, and by looking at the terrain, you'll see that it's not very green. Okay, it's kind of a brownish, and this person is actually our friend who's taking a tree ring sample at this moment. And by combining the living trees, dead trees, and archaeological wood samples, we were able to construct a chronology for our study sites going back 1,500 years BC. So that's how long the tree ring record could be. But what I want to focus on today are actually these tombs. So in this region that we, in our study region, there were two ancient kingdoms. One is the Tuyuhun. Let's see, is that the pointer? Oh, I guess not. And that actually is a very interesting kingdom. It was originally located in northeastern China, and it migrated a couple thousand miles, okay, to the northwestern corner of the Tibetan Plateau. And they exist there for about 250 to 300 years or so. At the same time, there was this Tubo, or the ancient Tibetan kingdom, that is growing at that time. And the Tibetan kingdom is actually getting stronger and stronger, and they started to conquer the other tribes in the surrounding region. Okay, and then in our study region, we have lots of these ancient tombs, and most of those tombs are dated, from the Tang Dynasty and earlier. Okay, so we're looking at this period of time from 300 AD to about 800 AD, this 500-year period of time. So you see all these little circles there, these are all ancient tombs dated to that period. And the reason you have this sort of a dark portion at the top is because these tombs are all robbed. The tomb robbing in this region was just, I don't know, it's so bad that the government archaeologists, including archaeologists working in universities and the research institutions, they can only follow the tomb robbers to get to whatever being left behind. And for us, we sort of follow the government archaeologists to see what they would get, such as the archaeological wood samples. And then you see this road, right? In the previous, you see this road, that's the road that we drive when we go out to almost daily, back and forth to our sampling site. And then there is this structure here. That is the largest tomb of this entire region. It is a well-known tomb, and this one is the current excavation site. And there are many smaller tombs around here. So here's the excavation site. This is the largest structure, and you can see this little notch here. That structure was damaged for whatever reason. So just one day, because we got a couple of new members on the team, was that you've never seen this tomb before, let's go there and take a look. So we played tourists that day, and that's what we saw. The roof of this structure collapsed. That's a little notch here. It collapsed recently. So we were able to collect these beams from the roof of this tomb falling down, and then we cut a few pieces. Then we also drill a few cores, Turing cores, and then we were able to plot them out. And we discovered that all of these samples, they all stopped in this year of 8715. So what that means is that the structure, the roof, was put on during this time. So the wood was cut after the growing season of 8715, and probably before the growing season of 8716. So we were able to narrow it down to when the structure was completed. Because this one was the largest tomb of the region, we speculated that it's got to be for somebody who's important. And in the general culture for that period of time, right, we're looking at 8700 or so, for somebody who's important, they would build their tomb before they die. So that when they die, they can be buried almost immediately. The funeral could go on immediately. Then they cover the tomb, and then you're done, right? Okay. But we checked all the existing literature. We could not find anyone who's important who died in that year. And then we worked with both historians and archaeologists, and nobody knows. So that's the really interesting part of it. The second thing that is even more interesting to me, at least, after 8800, there are no more tombs like this anymore, even for the smaller ones. They're just gone. So one theory is that, remember those two kingdoms? The Tibetan kingdom conquered the other one, and it just, performed a genocide. Essentially, for the warfare during that time, all the males being killed, essentially, all the females become slaves, for the winning side of it. So that's definitely the possibility. And here are the samples being polished, so you can see the rings there. And when that's the 650, this is 700, and just a little bit there, that's 715. So here is the year, and this is the Tang Dynasty. For any of you who have studied a little bit of Chinese history, this is a really interesting time period, especially for the area that we're looking at. And this was an article published in early 2000s. What this article shows is that you have the temperature variation in East China, and then this is the smooth temperature anomaly. And then they matched this with the number of wars. And there seems to be this relationship when it's getting cold, right? You have more wars or social unrest going on. This is a controversial in social science, in history, right? This is a typical thing that we would brand as environmental determinism. It's a big no-no in social science, right? Okay, but we decided to sort of pursue this a little bit more. So we looked at a different region, that's East China. So we looked at the northwestern part of the region. Again, we took lots of tree ring data, and we were thinking when the northern tribes tried to make the decision whether they want to invade the southern part of China, that decision making gotta be more than just temperature, right? So we think probably the moisture condition, amount of rainfall would play a role there as well. So it's like for the northern nomads, right? They tend to follow the places where you can get enough food for their herds, and the herds would need grass, essentially. So we're looking for the time periods when there is a transition from relatively wet condition into drier conditions, and then to see how the number of wars would change over time. And you see that, and that's the frequency of wars being initiated, and you have more wars going on here. And then for this period that we're interested in, it's 80, 300 to 500, you actually have less. But we did a little bit more digging, and what we discovered is that there was this mass transition of population, over 10,000 people, that's in the historical records, moved from this region that we were studying to the southern part or southwestern part. Probably, we're not entirely sure, but probably due to the change of the climatic condition during that period of time. So that's probably the reason that during this period of time, when it's actually dry in this region, there were fewer wars or social unrest during that period of time. About 10 years ago, I brought undergraduate students who were was supported by the SURE program with me to do field work. Here's that team. And this guy, who was a Tibetan, was our guide for that trip. And he was so impressed with Armand, the student, that he and his daughter-in-law and his grandson visited Armand in our hotel. So we took this picture, and I said, now Armand, you have a family in China. If I need to pick a tree of my choice, I would pick this one. Okay, it's a, I don't know how to pronounce it. It's a Populus euphratica. It's a tree that grows on pure sand, as you can see. That's the living ones, right? And then this is the dead one. And the saying goes like, when the tree is alive, it will be living for 1,000 years. After it died, it will stand for 1,000 years. After it falls, it will lay down there without decay for another 1,000 years. That will be a good sample for my Turing study. So some people tried, I didn't, but some people tried, and they discovered that the growth of these trees have nothing to do with the climate. Because the roots are so deep that it gets to groundwater. Thank you.